And so let me just wish everybody a happy Poson Poya Day. I know it's very significant, holy day or sacred day in the history of Sri Lanka, since this is the day that commemorates the arrival of the Arahant Mahinda in Sri Lanka. And so I thought it appropriate on this occasion to use as the basis for my Dhamma talk today the Chula Hatti Padopama Sutta, the shorter discourse on the simile of the elephant's footprint, which is said to be the sermon or discourse of the Buddha that Mahinda used as a basis for teaching the Dhamma to Devanam Piyatissa when they met at the place now called Mahintale. And I first came across the mention of that connection in the late Walpala Rahula's book called The History of Buddhism in Ceylon many, many years ago. And I have that page now in electronic form opened in front of me. And I'll just read what Venerable Walpala Rahula says about this connection between the two. So he writes, and this is on, let me see the page number, page 50 in his History of Buddhism in Ceylon. He says that Mahinda was convinced that the king was intelligent enough to understand the teaching of the Buddha, and so he proceeded at once to preach the Chula Hatti Padopama Sutta to him. And then Venerable Rahula writes, the selection of the sutta by Mahinda for the first sermon was very appropriate. The sutta gives a clear idea of the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. It describes how one is converted to Buddhism and becomes a bhikkhu or monk. It also describes in detail the simple and holy life of the bhikkhu, the sublime qualities he practices, the things from which he abstains, and so on, the various stages of development of his life, and his attainment of arhatship, the final fruit of Buddhism. The sutta also contains almost all the principal teachings of the Buddha, such as the Four Noble Truths. And so it was necessary for Mahinda to convey to his host, that is to King Devanapiyatissa, who knew nothing about Buddhism, an idea of the Sangha and their mode of life, so that the king might learn how to treat his new guests. At the end of the sermon, Devanampiyatissa and his retinue express their willingness to embrace the new faith. So that is what the Venerable Rahula writes about that encounter between the newly arrived Arahat Mahinda and the reigning king of Sri Lanka, Devanampiyatissa. And so the particular subject of this discourse, at least the sort of the theme that ties the various parts together, is the question, how does one know that the Buddha is an enlightened one? On what basis can one achieve this certain knowledge, not just faith, but certain knowledge that the Buddha is, or that the ascetic Gautama is Sama Sambuddho, a perfectly enlightened one? And what I've done, instead of sort of jumping directly into the Chula Hatti Sutta, I took several other suttas which deal with this theme of investigating the Buddha or investigating the teacher in order to ascertain whether they are qualified to be a teacher, whether they are themselves enlightened or are capable of teaching the path to enlightenment. And what's an interesting feature of the Chula Hatti Padopama Sutta is that it begins with wrong reasons unqualified reasons, inadequate reasons for concluding that the Buddha is an enlightened one. And I find something of a parallel to this in another sutta also in the Majjhima Nikaya. This is sutta number 95. It's called the Chunky Sutta. And at the beginning of the sutta, there is a prominent Brahmin by the name of Chunky who is intending to go. He hears that the Buddha has arrived on the outskirts of his town and is dwelling there with his community of monks. And Chunky hears the good report about the Buddha, and he's intending to go out to visit him. But then the other Brahmins, his peers in the Brahmin community, hear that their leader, Chunky, is going out to visit the Buddha, to visit this ascetic Gotama from the second clan, and they come to him and try to convince him, you shouldn't be going to visit the Buddha, but rather it's the ascetic Gotama should be coming to visit you because you're like the prominent Brahmin in this region. And who is he? He's just like a drifter, a wanderer. So you are the sort of most prominent one, and he should be coming to visit you as a sign of respect. And then Chunky, the Brahmin Chunky, gives his Brahmin friends a set of reasons why he should be going to visit the Buddha. And so we could take these to be maybe inadequate reasons for placing faith in the Buddha as an enlightened one. So Chunky says, among his reasons, he says that the ascetic Gotama is well born on both sides. He comes from an excellent family. Therefore, I should go to visit him. The ascetic Gotama left the worldly life. When he left the worldly life, he abandoned a lot of gold and silver. In other words, he went forth from a very wealthy family. And so we have good birth, wealthy family. The ascetic Gotama is handsome, beautiful, possessing supreme beauty of complexion. The ascetic Gotama is virtuous, possessing wholesome virtue. Of course, possessing wholesome virtue is a qualification of an enlightened one, but it's not the highest qualification. The ascetic Gotama is a gifted speaker who speaks words that are distinct, flawless, and communicate the meaning. So we could have a teacher today who is very eloquent, and on the basis of his eloquence, his gift in speech, we think that he is an enlightened teacher. Okay, the ascetic Gotama has many disciples, many followers. The ascetic Gotama went forth from a wealthy family, a family with great wealth and many possessions. And then finally, King Bimbisara of Magadha, together with his wife and children, have become disciples of the ascetic Gotama. King Pasenadi of Kosala and his wife and children have gone for refuge. And even our friend, the Brahmin Hokarasati, and his wife and children have gone for refuge to the ascetic Gotama. Okay, so those are, we could say, a list of wrong reasons. Of course, they might be adequate reasons for a Brahmin to want to go to visit the Buddha, but on their own, they would not be adequate reasons for having the confidence and trust that this person, the ascetic Gotama, is Samma Sambuddha, a fully enlightened one. Okay, then later in the sutta, the same sutta, the protagonist shifts from the Brahmin Chanki to a young Brahmin who enters into a debate with the Buddha. And at a certain point, this young Brahmin realizes that the Buddha has some kind of special capacities, special abilities, special knowledges. And so he thinks that the Buddha is worth inquiring from the Buddha about the way to the realization of truth. And so now he says to him, he's referring to him as Bo Gotama, Master Gotama. So he says, in what way is there the discovery of truth? In what way does one discover truth? In other words, how does one come to a realization of truth? And then the Buddha explains in stages. So he says that there may be a monk who is living near a certain village or town, and then you go to him and you investigate him in regard to three qualities. That is, states based on greed, states based on hatred, states based on delusion. Of course, this person who's making the inquiry is not able to read his mind, presumably not able to read the mind, but he examines this presumptive teacher to see whether there's anything in his behavior, his bodily actions, his speech, his reactions to others, his way of engaging with others that reveals the presence in his mind of greed, hatred, and delusion. And especially the sutta emphasizes, is there sort of any possibility that he might be making out of greed, hatred, or delusion false claims to knowledge that he doesn't possess, or that he might teach others in ways that might mislead them, in ways that would lead to their harm and suffering. And so when you investigate that presumptive teacher, then looking at their bodily behavior, their speech, their way of interacting with others, you see that there are no traces, no signs of greed, hatred, and delusion. And then you listen to the Dhamma taught by that presumptive teacher, and you get the impression that that Dhamma, that teaching, is very deep, peaceful, sublime, very subtle, and it comes from good intentions that is being taught out of, we could say, metta and karuna, kindness and compassion. And so then when you have investigated that teacher and you've seen that he's purified from these defilements, at least by way of his actions and his speech, then you place faith in him, a kind of initial faith. You visit and pay respects to him. You listen to his teaching and you put his teaching into practice. You examine it, strive. And then when your striving reaches the culmination, the Buddha says, then you realize with the body the supreme truth and see it by penetrating it with wisdom. In this way, the Buddha says, there is the discovery of truth, the initial realization of truth. But the Buddha says, as yet, at this point, one hasn't arrived at the full and final realization of truth. And so, even though this particular sutta doesn't use the familiar categories of like stream entry, once returning, non-returning, arhatship, but we could infer, since the sutta speaks about realizing with the body, the supreme truth, and penetrating it with wisdom, we could take this to be the attainment of any of the three lower stages of attainment, at least stream entry, but it could be once returning or non-returning. But because it says you haven't arrived at the final realization of truth, it's not yet arhatship. But then the young Brahmin inquires, how is there the final arrival at truth? How does one get to the final and ultimate realization of truth? And then the Buddha says, it's nothing different from what I've explained, but what you have to do is just repeatedly develop and cultivate those same things. So basically, what you've done in the earlier stage, you've cultivate your sila, you've developed some degree of samadhi, and then based on that samadhi, you've developed your insight to the point that you've been able to realize the supreme truth. Probably that would be what we would call in the Abhidhamma terms, the attainment of the Magga Chitta, the Chitta that has arrived at the world transcending path. And now you have to keep on developing that concentration and wisdom until the wisdom matures to the point that one makes that final and complete arrival at truth. Okay, so this is one sutta which in certain ways is parallel to the process that will be described in the Chula Hathipadopama Sutta. But now I'm going to take still another sutta which deals with the process again in a similar way. We could see certain like parallels in the approach to realization that the Buddha teaches. And this is still another sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya. This is sutta number 47. It's called the Vimamsaka Sutta. That is the discourse about the investigator, one who makes an investigation. And here the Buddha is specifically inviting a monk to investigate himself. So he says that the monk who has that spirit of investigation should investigate me, the Tathagata, with respect to two kinds of states. And here he speaks about things that you can know through the eye, that is what you see. This would be the visible behavior of the Buddha. And then with respect to things that you can hear through the ear, in other words, the speech of the Buddha. And so you're investigating the Tathagata with regard, trying to find out whether there are any defiled states, any kind of, again, bodily action that you can see with your eyes, or any kind of defiled speech, rough speech, false speech, boastful speech that you can hear with the ear, kinds of actions, kinds of speech that would reveal the presence of any of the defilements, particularly greed, anger, conceit, delusion, restlessness, and so forth. And so when you investigate the Tathagata, the Buddha, you see there are no defiled states found in the Buddha, states that you can cognize through the eyes or through the ears. And then it goes on to you investigate the Buddha with regard to mixed states, states that are kind of mixture of the good and the bad. And there are none of those in the Tathagata. Are there only pure states cognizable in the Tathagata. And then you see all of the Buddha's behavior and all of his speech is pure, indicative of the absence of greed, hatred, and delusion. Okay, and then the sutta mentions other ways. I'm not going to go into all of the detail, but other ways that the disciple investigates the Buddha, seeing first whether he is free, whether he behaves with restraint, naturally, not from fear of blame, whether he avoids sensual pleasures because he's free from lust, and so on. And whenever he investigates him, he finds that the Buddha is free from defiled states, that all of his behavior, all of his speech is pure, worthy, admirable, and so forth. And so at that point, the disciple, the investigator, gains enough confidence and trust to approach the Buddha for the purpose of hearing the Dhamma. So now, on the basis of this investigation, one has gained faith and trust. And so one then approaches the teacher, the Buddha, in order to hear the Dhamma. And the text says that the teacher, the Buddha, teaches the Dhamma with its higher and higher levels, with its more and more sublime levels, with its dark and bright counterparts. And as the teacher is teaching the Dhamma in this way, then at a certain point, the disciple gains direct knowledge of the Dhamma that's being taught. And then he comes to a conclusion about the teachings, and he's able to place the confidence in the teacher thus that the Blessed One is fully enlightened, that the Dhamma is well proclaimed by the Buddha, and that the Sangha is practicing the good way. And the sutta, it uses the expression, it says, here in Pali, it uses the expression nitang gacchati, which is translated here, he comes to a conclusion. And we're going to see that this expression, nitang gacchati, coming to a conclusion, is the theme, the main point in the Chulahati Padopama Sutta. Okay, so this is, I wanted to sort of approach the Chulahati Padopama Sutta by first looking at these other suttas, which also treat in different ways, but in parallel ways, the process of coming to a conclusion about the Buddha as an enlightened one and about the Dhamma as being the liberating truth. And now we can turn to the Chulahati Padopama Sutta itself. Okay, so when the sutta opens, there is a certain Brahmin by the name of Janusoni. I think he was supposed to be like the court chaplain to King Pasenadi of Savatthi. And he's a very wealthy Brahmin, so he's riding in a chariot drawn by white horses. And as he's coming out from Savatthi, he sees a wanderer approaching in the opposite direction. And he asks this wanderer named Pilotika, "Where are you coming from?" And the wanderer says, "I've gone to visit the ascetic Gautama. And then the wanderer Pilotika praises the Buddha very highly and says he's a very wise man, best teacher here in India. And then Janusoni says, you really have such confidence in this ascetic Gautama. What is the basis for your confidence? Why do you have such strong trust and devotion to him? Okay, and then the wanderer introduces the simile of the footprint. Though I suspect the simile of the footprint was actually composed by the compilers of the text and put in his mouth. But anyway, the simile is going to form the basis for the sutta. Okay, so the wanderer says, suppose there was a skillful woodman that is like a forest attendant who enters an elephant forest and he sees in the forest a big elephant's footprint. And when he sees that footprint, he comes to the conclusion, indeed, that's the footprint of a big bull elephant. And in the same way, now the wanderer says, I saw 4 footprints of the ascetic Gautama, and on that basis, I came to the conclusion. You see, that's that expression again, nitang, I guess in this case it's nitang gacchami. I came to the conclusion, or nitang agachi. I came to the conclusion that the Buddha the Bhagava is fully enlightened, that his Dhamma is well proclaimed, and that his disciples, the Sangha, is practicing the good way. So, what are these 4 footprints that this wanderer has seen? Okay, so the first is that he's seen certain learned kshatriyas, people from the aristocratic clan, who intended to dispute with the Buddha and overturn him, beat him in debate. And so they formulate some tricky questions. They go to him with the intention of refuting his doctrine with these subtle questions. And when they come to him, the Buddha teaches them the Dhamma, and they don't even ask the questions. But as soon as they hear the Buddha preach the Dhamma, they're full of joy and confidence, and they become his disciples. So he says, that is the first footprint of the ascetic Gautama that I saw, on the basis of which I came to the conclusion the ascetic Gautama is the Bhagava, the Blessed One, fully enlightened, fully enlightened one. And his Dhamma is the liberating teaching, well proclaimed. Okay, the second footprint, he says, I've seen certain learned Brahmins who are skilled Brahmins with many disciples, apprentices, and they go to meet the Buddha with the intention of defeating him in debate. And they, when they hear the Buddha's Dhamma, they give up their idea of arguing with him and they become his disciples. That's the second footprint. Then the third footprint, I've seen certain learned householders. Probably these would be the pundits who are clever, wise, skillful in debate. They go to meet the Buddha with the intention of defeating him in debate. And what happens? They too become his disciples. So that's the third footprint on the basis of which I came to the conclusion the Blessed One, the ascetic Gautama, is the fully enlightened Buddha. And then the fourth footprint, in this case, he's seen certain learned summoners. These would be the non-Buddhist ascetics who went to the Buddha with the intention of defeating him in debate. And not only do they become his disciples, but they give up their previous allegiance, their allegiance to their previous teachers, and they ask the Buddha for the permission to go forth into the homeless life. They go forth and they become bhikkhus, monks, and they follow the Buddha's path of training. So he says, those are the four footprints that I've seen, footprints of the ascetic Gautama, on the basis of which I came to the conclusion that the Buddha is the fully enlightened one. Okay, so now on a later occasion, Janusoni decides he's heard this praise of the Buddha, so he decides that I have to go meet him. And so he goes to uh, the, not the bamboo grove, to the Jetavana to meet the Buddha and greets him. And then he relates to the Buddha his entire conversation with the wanderer Pilotika about the four footprints on the basis of which the wanderer concluded the Buddha is a fully enlightened one. But the Buddha doesn't accept that explanation. He says, at this point, the simile of the elephant's footprint has not been fulfilled in detail. And now I'm going to tell you how it's fulfilled. Okay, and now the Buddha, again, he starts off by picking up the same simile of the elephant woodsman who enters the elephant forest. And so he says the woodman enters the forest and he sees on the ground at a certain point, he sees a big elephant's footprint. And now a foolish woodsman might conclude, ah, so there's a big bull elephant in the forest. But a wise woodsman wouldn't draw that conclusion. And why is that? The Buddha says, because there might be small female elephants that leave a big footprint, and that could be one of their footprints. And so the woodman goes further. He sees some other sign that there's a big elephant in the forest, but still he doesn't draw the conclusion because there can be she elephants with prominent teeth. They leave a big footprint and they leave some scrapings high up. So it goes on with some other factors. A third time, a fourth time, each time the elephant woodman sees a big elephant footprint, but he doesn't conclude, therefore, there must be a big bull elephant in the forest. But finally, the woodman goes further in the forest, and then at a certain point in the distance, he sees a big bull elephant resting at the foot of a tree or walking around in the open. And then he comes to the conclusion that is a big bull elephant. So the point is that he doesn't draw inferences just on superficial signs, but it's only when he sees the elephant itself that he can draw the conclusion there's a big bull elephant here in this forest. And so concluding on the basis just of the footprints that there's an elephant, big bull elephant in the forest, that is like concluding that the Buddha is an enlightened one just by seeing the superficial signs of the Tathagata, but one hasn't yet seen, really seen that quality that makes the Buddha an enlightened one. Okay, so now the Buddha is going to apply the simile, and he's going to start off using what is the sort of standard model of the monastic training that we find in many suttas or several suttas in the Majjhima Nikaya. So he starts off with a Tathagata, a Buddha appears in the world. He teaches the Dhamma that's good in the beginning, good in the middle, good in the end. He reveals the pure, holy life. And then a certain householder or householder's son hears the Dhamma, and hearing the Dhamma, he acquires faith in the Tathagata. And on the basis of that faith, he decides to go forth into the homeless life. Okay, so you see the starting point here is faith in the Tathagata. But the faith is not yet a definitive conclusion that the Tathagata or the teacher, the ascetic Gautama, is a fully enlightened Buddha. But one has to start someplace. And so, based on the teaching or based on the report about the Buddha, based on the teaching, especially one hears how the teaching is good in the beginning, good in the middle, good in the end, on that basis, one acquires faith, and the faith is strong enough that one comes to the conclusion it's not enough just for me to become a faithful lay disciple, but I want to follow this path to the end. And so, based on that full faith, he goes forth into the homeless life, puts on the ochre robes, and then takes up the monastic training. And I'm not going to go through details of the monastic training, but we go through the observance of the silas, the bhikkhu silas, abstaining from killing, stealing, observing celibacy, observing the principles of right speech, um, observing the various, we call these the minor precepts. And then when it acquires contentment, contentment with the robes and with the alms bowl, then restraint of the sense faculties, then practicing mindfulness and sampajanya, clear comprehension in all activities. So all of those factors are sort of the foundations or basis of the higher training. Okay, then we come to the discipline training in seclusion and meditation. So the text says that possessing this noble virtue, this restraint of the sense faculties, this mindfulness and clear comprehension, the disciple goes to a secluded place like the forest, the foot of a tree, the mountainside, and so forth. And he establishes that as his place for meditation. Then after his meal, he comes to his meditation place, then sits down, establishes mindfulness, and then abandons each of the five hindrances, abandoning sensual lust, ill will, dullness and drowsiness, restlessness, and doubt. Okay, now we start to come to the key point. Now it's like the elephant woodsman is now getting deeper and deeper into the forest. Okay, so now this text says about the monk He says, having abandoned the five hindrances, those defilements of the mind, secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states of mind, he enters and dwells in the first jhana, accompanied by vitaka and vichara, and with this rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. And now the Buddha says, this is called a footprint of the Tathagata, something scraped by the Tathagata, a mark of the Tathagata. But the noble disciple does not yet come to the conclusion the Blessed One is fully enlightened, the Dhamma is well proclaimed by the Blessed One, the Sangha is practicing the good way. And so we see the first jhana is something, it's part of the path through which the Buddha has walked in his own process of attaining enlightenment. We can see this especially in the Majjhima Nikaya. We see it in Sutta number 4. We see that the Buddha describing his process of enlightenment goes through the four jhanas and then through the three vijas, the higher knowledges, until finally he liberates the mind from the defilements. So now the disciple is following that same path, but at this point, with the first jhana, he's only seen the first footprint of the Tathagata. And since he's a wise disciple, he doesn't he, he doesn't come to the conclusion, since I've attained the jhana that the Buddha's attained, this means the Buddha is fully enlightened. Because there can be non-Buddhist ascetics or even Buddhist ascetics who attain the jhanas but are not yet enlightened. And so he realizes that he's on the right track, but it's not enough to draw that conclusion. And so he continues walking through the forest, so to speak. This will be the forest of the meditative attainments. And so now he continues with his practice of samadhi. He eliminates vitaka and vichara, applied and sustained thought, and he enters the second jhana, in which he's experiencing that piti sukha that is born of concentration, the rapture and pleasure born of concentration. And so the text says that this too is called a footprint of the Tathagata, but the disciple doesn't yet come to the conclusion that the Blessed One is a fully enlightened one. Okay, again, the practitioner is going further. And so now the monk continues with his training in samadhi, and he drops, he drop, excuse me, he drops the piti, drops the rapture, and he dwells in equanimity with mindfulness and clear comprehension, still feeling this bodily bliss, and he enters into the third jhana. And the Buddha says, this too is called a footprint of the Tathagata. So this is now the third footprint, but the disciple doesn't yet come to the conclusion the Blessed One is fully enlightened. Okay, so now we're getting sort of deeper and deeper into the forest, getting closer and closer to the place in the depth of the forest where the bull elephant roams. But we still have some distance to go. And so now the disciple continues with the training and samadhi, abandons sukha and earlier abandoned dukkha. So now he's abandoned the sukha, the pleasure, the bliss, and remains in equanimity with mindfulness due to equanimity. And he enters into that fourth jhana. And this too, the Buddha says, is a footprint of the Tathagata. It's the footprint, but the disciple doesn't yet come to the conclusion. And so there's still some further distance to go. And so now the disciple turns that bright, purified, concentrated mind, turns it to the recollection of past lives and starts recollecting many, many past lives, hundreds and thousands of past lives in detail. And this too, the Buddha says, is called a footprint of the Tathagata, but the disciple doesn't yet come to the conclusion the Blessed One is fully enlightened. Still another stage to go. With a concentrated mind, the disciple gives rise to the divine eye by which he can see how living beings pass away and take rebirth in accordance with their karma. So this is the kind of knowledge that the Buddha himself attained on the night of his enlightenment in the middle watch of the night, seeing how beings pass away and take rebirth in good conditions and bad conditions, fortunate and miserable as determined by their karma. And so the Buddha says this too is called a footprint of the Tathagata, but still the disciple doesn't come to the conclusion the Blessed One is fully enlightened. So now we've seen come across 6 sets of footprints, but not enough to draw that absolute conclusion. But now we go further with that focused and concentrated mind. And now the disciple turns that mind to arousing the knowledge that will bring the destruction of the asavas. And so the text says, now the disciple understands correctly. This is dukkha. This is the origin of dukkha, the origin of suffering. This is the cessation of suffering, the end of the suffering of repeated birth and death. In other words, this is nibbana. This is the way leading to the cessation of suffering. So we have the 4 noble truths formulated around dukkha or suffering. But then the sutta also has the framework of the 4 noble truths centered upon the asavas, translated here as the taints. So these are the asavas. This is the origin of the asavas. This is the cessation of the asavas. This is the way leading to the cessation of the asavas. Okay, so now at this point, the disciple in is engaged in that knowledge that brings the destruction of the taints, the destruction of the asavas. And so now the sutta or the Buddha says, this too is called a footprint of the Tathagata, something scraped by the Tathagata, something marked by the Tathagata, but a noble disciple still has not yet come to the conclusion that the Blessed One is fully enlightened. But now the sutta adds something else different from what is said in regard to the jhanas and the other two higher knowledges. It says, he has not yet come to the conclusion the Blessed One is fully enlightened, but he is in the process of coming to this conclusion. I have the Pali here. The Pali reads, Nutveva tava Arya Savago Nitang Gato Hoti. So this is the negation. Nitang Gato is the past participle. He hasn't yet come to the conclusion, but it continues, Apicha ko Nitang Gachati. That's the present tense in the sense of a process. He is coming to the conclusion. He is reaching the conclusion. That is, he's really close now. He's about to see the elephant in the forest. He's about to see the Buddha as fully enlightened. But there's still a little ways to go. I think we might, if we want to use sort of the technical scheme of the Nikayas, we can say that when the disciple is seeing and understanding the Four Noble Truths, whether phrased in terms of dukkha or in terms of the asavas, he's at the stages of, or maybe the paths of stream entry, once returning and non-returning. But now he pushes his practice further to the path of arahatship. And so the text continues, when he knows and sees thus, when he knows and sees the Four Noble Truths, his mind is liberated from the taint of sensual desire, the kamasava, the craving for sensual pleasures. His mind is liberated from the bhavasava, the taint of craving for repeated existence within the round of birth and death. His mind is liberated from the avijjasava, the taint of ignorance. And when it's liberated, there comes the knowledge it's liberated. Birth is finished, the cycle of rebirths is finished, the brahmacharya, the spiritual life, has been lived. What had to be done, developing the noble path, that has been done. Now there's no more coming back to any state of being, to any state of existence. And then the Buddha says, at this point, he says, this too is called a footprint of the Tathagata, something scraped by the Tathagata, a mark of the Tathagata. And at this point, the noble disciple has come to the conclusion the Blessed One is fully enlightened. The Dhamma taught by the Blessed One is well proclaimed, and the community of the Blessed One's disciples is practicing the good path. And at this point, the Buddha says, the simile of the elephant's footprint is properly fulfilled in detail. And so in the Elephant Sutta, Elephant Footprint Sutta, the Brahmin Janusoni says, magnificent Master Gotama, magnificent Master Gotama. And then he declares himself a lay follower of the Buddha, but probably on that first Poson in Mahintale in Sri Lanka, when the Arahat Mahinda was proclaiming the sutta to King Devanam at the end, King Devanam might have said, "Magnificent, Venerable Mahinda, magnificent, Venerable Mahinda, I go for refuge to the Blessed One, to the Dhamma, and to the Sangha." Okay, maybe that should do for my presentation of the simile of the elephant's footprint.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you very much, Most Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. I think that was in great detail that it was explained about the simile of the elephant footprint,
Mm,
and also with reference to the special day of Poson Poya, and where maybe King Devanam would have said the same thing at that time. So I think that was a very good closure, and my pay merit to Most Venerable
mm,
Bhikkhu Bodhi for that. I think very a Dhamma sermon that I think kept everyone awake
mm,
and gave them the real meaning
mm,
of what we need to do.
mm,
I think the two more important ones of the faith in the Buddha, and of course observing
mm,
Sila and the other areas of great importance. So I would now like anyone who has any questions to kindly send it on the Q&A. And from our panelists, we have the Venerable Vajirarame Jnanasiha Thero. I'm sure that Venerable Thero may have any comments or questions. So can I invite Venerable Jnanasiha Thero?
Thank you very much. It's only a few comments. At the initial stages, in 1998, Venerable Bodhi and myself, in my lay life, we had our conference, international conference, and the decision was taken to approach the government or the
mm,
UN to make this a declaration, a, a, a day of observance. And it's as a result of that, and we are happy the Venerable Bodhi was the first to deliver that talk at the UN, and there is this connection. And also,
mm,
I'm very happy that when at the Vietnam, he was very bold enough, the Venerable Bodhi, if there were certain sections that had to be deleted, he said, if that be so, I'm not coming. So that's the type of spirit that I would like very much, and I like it
yeah.
very much. And also, he was mentioned about Sen War,
About what?
and there also had connect the Sen War, C-N, Sen War,
Senwa, Senwa,
C-E-N-W,
Sen. Oh, yeah.
Sen War. It's actually, it was started, they needed funds, and when I was the United Nations FAO, I provided the first funds, $5,000, and it was
Mm,
with that they started, and I'm
I
very
see.
happy that it's continuing even
Mm,
now. So it's a very interesting talk, and I'll be following this in my talk this Saturday at the service of
mm,
the Buddha. If Venerable Anand, Arhat Mahinda visits Sri Lanka now, what would be his theme of the talk? He chose Chulahatipada Sutta when he first entered, but if he comes now, what would be the sutta or the discourse he would choose is something that's very interesting, and I
mm,
thought would be useful to listen to. So I'm very happy, Venerable Sir, to see you again. You are always
mm,
inspiration to all of us,
mm.
and from my
Thank you.
life also. And I'm very happy to see you and listen to this talk. Thank you very
Mm.
much.
Yeah, with regard to my talk, Vesak talk in Vietnam, I was already there. I was at the premises. It's not that I said I won't be coming, but
Yes.
on that morning they asked me tone down the last part
Yeah.
in which I spoke. I'll tell you what I spoke. I spoke about the Israeli, it's a genocide in Gaza. And I said that we have to, as Buddhists, we have to sort of stand up and speak against that. And they asked me, tone it down, tone it down. And then I considered, can I tone it down? And I went off to a little room to look over the speech. And I thought, no, I can't tone it down. If they don't want me to give it, then I'll just vacate the keynote address and let somebody else come in and give the address. And I told them that, and they said, okay, you give it as you wrote it. And then I did.
Thank you very much, Bhikkhu Bodhi. Now, since Senva was mentioned, there is a question here. The anonymous attendee says, Most Venerable Bodhi, Bhikkhu Bodhi, how could we contribute to the organization in Sri Lanka that was mentioned by you?
Okay, the organizations. So if you're in Sri Lanka, then it's easiest to donate to the organizations themselves, our partner organizations, rather than to Buddhist Global Relief, which is in the United States. So the partner organizations, one is Senwar, which is CENWWOR. It's the Center for Women's Research. That is one organization. Another is called Shraddha Charity. A third is called Child Action Lanka. That's an organization that provides meals to children from very poor families so that they go to school meals. And then the fourth organization is called Karuna Trust, which has a number of philanthropic projects. Yeah, the founder of Karuna Trust, when I was at the Buddhist Publication Society, they had I still have a printing firm in Colombo. Now I think it's in, not Homagama, maybe it's Homagama, called Karuna and Sons Printing Press. And so they were a printer for the Buddhist Publication Society. And now they have as a kind of offshoot a humanitarian organization called Karuna Trust.
If they want details, are they available on the website or any place?
Yeah, they all have their own websites.
Right. Right. Thank you very much,
But
Venerable.
those are, if there are viewers of this program in the United States, Canada, or Great Britain, they could contribute directly, I think, to Buddhist Global Relief. You just look at the website, and then there's a, what do you call this, a menu of ways to donate.
Thank you. I have invited Bante Kusala. Bante Kusala, you is in the States. Any comments or questions?
Professor Lakshman, I'm in Toronto right now, and my reverential greetings to Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. Wonderful Dhamma talk as always.
Thank you.
And I also admire Venerable's courage that you displayed in UN. Such a great example. Thank you. Thank you for doing that, Venerable. I think Venerable gave a detailed discourse already, and I'm not going to vexate him with my questions. Thank you so much. Happy Poson,
Thank you.
everybody.
Yeah, you too. Yeah. You're at the West End Vihara?
No, Venerable, I am, but last night I came to the Bengali Buddhist temple near the airport.
Oh, I see. There's the
Because
Bengali temple
we have
there, yeah.
so many monks at the Western Buddhist temple.
I see. Yeah.
Giving, kind of giving away all the space to other monks.
I see.
Yes, just Most Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, I think when you were in there, we had our ambassador, he's here with us, former ambassador Rohan Pereira. I am sure you remember him. And
I remember him from New York, yeah.
New York. Rohan, you like to say anything?
No, just a brief comment to say it's always a pleasure to listen to Venerable Bodhis. deep insights, but explained in very simple terms. So once again, it would express our deepest appreciation to Poson. We always look forward to his discourse. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohan. Before we go to questions, just one more maybe from our panel. Dr. Sumana, you wish to make a short comment?
I'm always happy that individuals like Bhikkhu Bodhi gives talks like this, very clear and a lot informative talks, and we learn a lot from Venerable. And thank you very much indeed. Maybe I can draw your attention to a question that I thought very much needed to elaborate on. Maybe Venerable can give us some kind of comments on it. That is, in the popular society, often we hear people use that Buddhism encourages us to be seekers of truth rather than to be seekers of the wholesome, kusala gavesi or satya gavesi. People always, I mean, in the popular context, I hear people use very much satya gavesi instead of kusala gavesi, but I can't find satya gavesi anywhere in the canonical texts. I mean, that is, I think, Venerable might have answered this question before. Are we having any comments or kind of differences, Venerable, about this? To be a Satyagavesi person or a Kusalagavesi person? Where Buddha uses, I think, to be Kusalagavesi rather than to be Satyagavesi.
Yeah, I don't think one finds the expression Satya Gavesi as such, but in order to reach, let's say, the highest stage, the stage of liberation, one has to have the realization of Satya. And so the Chunky Sutta speaks about the how does one make the discovery of truth? I think it's Satyanubodha. And how does one finally attain the truth? And then, of course, what the Buddha realizes is the Chattari Arya Sachani, Four Noble Truths. And usually at the when he's giving a sequential discourse, it says that at the culmination, he teaches that Dhamma special to the enlightened ones, dukkha, its origin, its cessation, and the path. So I don't think from the Buddhist perspective that you could really separate the quest for the good and the quest for the truth, since the truth that's being sought is not just objective truth, like scientific truth, but it is liberating truth. And liberating truth can only be realized by a person who has fulfilled the kusala by way of sila or good behavior, and the higher kusala by way of the development of the mind. And so the two are sort of intimately interconnected.
Thank you very much indeed, Venerable sir.
There is a question from Dilini Vijaysurya. According to you, Most Venerable Bhante, is Buddhism a philosophy? Because a philosopher is a person who has a theory which may or may not necessarily be proven, but Lord Buddha has been able to make a discovery with reproducible results of his findings, which makes him more similar to a scientist. Don't you think? Question mark.
Oh, this is a kind of big question. I don't describe Buddhism first as a philosophy, because philosophy is just developed theoretical systems. Though also there are philosophers who also develop systems of ethical conduct, For example, like Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, they have ethics. But I take Buddhism has to be seen in its original Indian context, as I would call it, maybe a discipline of realization and liberation. So that would be what the Dhamma is in itself, a discipline of realization and liberation. I don't like to say it's scientific because scientific implies that it can be maybe publicly verifiable or objectively verifiable and demonstrable apart from a person's conduct and inner capacity for cognition. Whereas liberation in Buddhism depends on personal conduct and inner cognition. It's not the truth of the Dhamma is not something that can be objectively or publicly demonstrated, but has to be realized personally and inwardly.
Thank you. Next question is from Jayanta Vikramarachchi. Thank you very much for enlightening Dhamma sermon. Is it really necessary to attain different stages of jhanas to attain nirvana? I thought that getting rid of all the past bad karma and not creating any new bad karma and advance and live according to Dhamma will make you advance in the path.
Okay, there are several points here. Okay, there's a question whether the jhanas are necessary to gain liberation. And that's a question which has been within the Theravada tradition. It's always been disputed. And then there are two different camps. Some say jhana is absolutely necessary. Others say jhana is desirable, worthy, beautiful, but not absolutely necessary. I tend to lean towards the second position, that the jhanas are not absolutely necessary. And I follow, like here, the Visuddhimagga, the commentaries recognize that there are kinds of arahats who don't attain the jhanas, but develop a degree of samadhi sufficient to give rise to the liberating insights. And it seems to me that the Satipatthana Sutta in particular is delineating the path of practice that brings direct insight without necessary reliance on the jhanas. Okay, so that is one issue brought up in that question. The other point is that seems to be saying, is it enough just to lead a good life, not to do evil deeds and to ensure that all of one's actions are good and wholesome? I say that that is certainly desirable, and that would be a condition for progress in the Dhamma, but in itself, it's not sufficient. From good conduct, one has to pass on to the work of purifying the mind by overcoming the hindrances, the mental defilements in their manifest form, and then one has to go deeper and to uproot the defilements by developing that wisdom of insight that can cut the defilements at the root. So that requires that special training, special meditative training.
Thank you, Venerable. Next question from Ranjit Tabru. Reverend Sir, what is the correct interpretation or definition of the term fully enlightened rather than the parallels used by Brahmins?
I don't know what the parallels used by the Brahmins might be. The Brahmins have a list, a sets of terms by which they describe an ideal Brahmin. Sotio, Dotiko. I would have to look. There's a sutta which has a list of those terms, but the term Sammasambuddha, which is what I was rendering as fully enlightened, completely enlightened, seems to be distinctive to Buddhism. The Vedantic tradition also uses the term jnana or knowledge as sort of its vehicle for liberation. So they interpret knowledge differently from knowledge within Buddhism. For the Vedantic tradition, the knowledge is knowledge of Brahman, the ultimate reality, which is the same as the Atman, the indwelling self. Whereas for Buddhism, the liberating knowledge is just almost the opposite, anatta, the knowledge of non-self, the knowledge of the absence of an indwelling self and of a objective substratum for the world.
Thank you, Bhante. The next question from Pushparani Veerasinghe. Thank you very much, Most Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, for the excellent way Sutta was explained and presented. Then we have a question from Tamara De Silva. Most Venerable Swami Mahansa, so this sutta explains very well that one cannot enter the stream without meditating and attaining jhana and samadhi to gain wisdom. Therefore, the base on faith and sila, one has to train the mind on meditation. Am I correct, Bhante?
Except the initial part of the question where he said that the sutta shows that one can't attain stream entry without jhana.
Without meditating and attaining jhana and
Yeah,
samadhi.
yeah, that I don't think I would agree with. I think that in my understanding, one can attain like certainly stream entry once returning, I would say clearly without the jhanas, but there has to be generally some kind of training in meditation to develop a certain degree of calmness or samadhi, perhaps not the level of jhana, but there has to be a certain degree of samadhi and insight or vipassana to reach stream entry. That is the general rule, but we come across cases, actually many cases in the suttas, where inquirers come to the Buddha who have not done formal meditation in the past, but they come to the Buddha gives a discourse, and while they're listening to the discourse, right on the spot, they attain stream entry, once returning, non-returning. So my supposition is in previous existences, past lives, that they had practiced meditation and built up good, wholesome qualities, what we call paramis. And so they were ripe, extremely ripe, just like a lotus flower that's about to blossom. And all it needs is the light of the sun in order to blossom. And so these people had minds like the lotus flower. And so as soon as they hear the Dhamma, because of their past practices, they're able to awaken to the truth of the Dhamma.
Question, thank you. Question from Yong Chung Si. If stream entry requires the elimination of doubt, but here we see that we only gain this certainty in arhatship. Is this a contradiction?
I don't think it's a contradiction because the sutta on the elephant's footprint isn't so distinguishing the different stages. It isn't drawing distinction of the different stages. This is what happens at stream entry, once returning, non-returning, arhatship. But it's compressing the four stages together and just taking the development right through to arhatship. So it would seem to me that certainly at the stage of stream entry, one abandons doubt, and one will have that confirmed confidence, that avecca pasada, that the Buddha is fully enlightened, the Dhamma is well proclaimed, Sangha is practicing the good way. Already a stream entry, I would say.
Thank you very much. Time is 7:30. Can we take a few more questions, Most Venerable?
Oh, okay, yeah.
Right.
I just want to get a lozenge for my throat.
Right. Okay. Ready? There is a question from Dilipa Manavadu. How can Buddhism practitioners respond to the genocide in Palestine? It feels such a hopeless situation. Many turn the other way, saying it is karma. What should the right effort be to bring healing to all those suffering in the Middle East? How do we bring compassion to both oppression and oppressed?
It's a very, very difficult question, which I've really been sort of struggling with for 19, 20 months now.
Mm-hmm.
All I can say is that we shouldn't turn away. There's a tendency sometimes about Buddhists that we speak about dukkha, but we don't really want to look at it. But this is really the most terrible suffering going on in the world right now. I say we should not turn away from it, but we should be aware of it and keep it both in our minds and in our voices. Speak about it. Whatever country you're in, write to your representatives, to your president or prime minister to do something about it. Even though the great tragedy is that, for example, just a week ago, I think it was about a week ago, there was a vote at the United Nations Security Council to impose a ceasefire, to call for a ceasefire, unconditional ceasefire, release of all of the hostages being held by Hamas, the Israeli hostages, complete release for them, ceasefire. 14 countries, 14 nations at the Security Council, which has 15 nations, 14 nations voted in favor of the ceasefire. One country with veto power voted to veto the resolution, and that country is the United States. So I'm sad to say, but it is my country which is really the big obstacle to a solution. But we just have to keep on putting pressure on our governments to do something to stop that genocide.
Thank you, Bhante. The anonymous attendee, thank you so much, Venerable Sir, for the enlightening talk. I think that there is no person attaining Sotapatta or any other state, but it is just a state of understanding the truth. Therefore, thinking about it, is it worthwhile?
I'm not quite sure that I understand the question. If they're saying that there's nobody who's attaining stream entry,
Yes,
I don't think one could say that. I think there must be people attaining some of these stages. But the second part of the question was, is it worthwhile to think about the teaching?
1 minute. Yeah, or any other, but it is just a state of understanding the truth. Therefore, thinking about it, is it worthwhile?
Okay, so thinking about the teaching, thinking about the Dhamma certainly is worthwhile in that it brings a certain kind of panya, a certain kind of wisdom. This would be the wisdom that arises through reflection or thinking, but it's not sufficient. There has to be what's called bhavanamaya panya, the wisdom that arises through meditative development. And so one has to proceed from thinking about the teaching to actually cultivating the mind through meditation to develop the insight that sees into the truth of the teaching.
Thank you. Thank you. The anonymous attendee, Venerable Bodhi, how can one begin to eliminate Sakkaya Ditthi as a noise practitioner? I often notice the rising of the sense of I a few seconds after it appears. Any advice on how to recognize and catch it earlier?
Okay, the arising of the sense of I itself is not Sakkaya Ditthi, but that would be a subtler better, which is called Asmi Mana, the conceit I am. And so Sakaya Ditti is a formulated view or conceptual view of self, which arises when one grasps that sense of I that arises spontaneously and tries to figure it out, to figure out what is that sense of I referring to? What is the self? And then one formulates a view of self, taking the self to be either identical with one or another of the five aggregates, or existing within the five aggregates, or possessing the five aggregates. And so it's through, I would say, through study of the Dhamma and practice of insight, especially vipassana meditation, that one can weaken and eventually overcome Sakaya Ditti, the view of self, but to eliminate that subtle sense of I, really that is eliminated at the stage of arahatship. Even the non-returner still has that subtle sense of I. On this, the useful sutta is in the Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 22, sutta number 89. It's called the Kamaka Sutta. And don't think that I know all these sutta numbers by number. It's just that this question comes up so often. What is the difference between Sakaya Ditti and the sense of I, that I've often referred to the sutta to clarify the difference. And so the sutta explains how even in the non-returner who's eliminated the view of a self, that sense of I still clings to their mind, just like, what is the example? Like somebody who washes clothes in ancient India, they would use cow dung to wash clothes. And so the cow dung or the lime gets rid of the smell of the perspiration and so on. But then they still have to take the clothes and put them in a perfumed casket to get rid of the smell of the cow dung or the lime. And so the sense of I still clings to the five aggregates, even when after one has eliminated the view of a self in regard to the five aggregates.
Thank you very much, Most Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, for answering the questions and also the clarifications. I know that we have gone past the time, but thank you very much for agreeing. And I know because when I wrote to Most Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, because normally the Vesak Poya that Most Venerable gives the Dhamma sermon, Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi had just returned and said that he was very tired and was so then I thought that maybe I can maybe request for the Dhamma to be given for Poson, and I'm very thankful that Bhikkhu Bodhi really readily agreed, and the useful topic that was used, and also which is also a very important day for us, where Buddhism Buddhism arrived in Sri Lanka, and also that Bhikkhu Bodhi has been really doing a great service to Sri Lanka. I think maybe over 25 years in Sri Lanka, and even today continuing the great service to the world, which I think is something that we as Buddhists in Sri Lanka greatly appreciate the good work that was done, that has been done, and also to agreeing to speak, because I know that there are so many Sri Lankans who would like to listen to Most Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, and I must also appreciate and pay merit to our Venerable Vajrarame Jnanasiya and Bhate Kusala who were present today. So may I now invite our committee member, Kamal Nilavira, to pay merit and thanks to Bhikkhu Bodhi.
Lakshman, thank you very much. Buddha Saranai to all. our panel today includes Venerable Vajrarami, Nanasiya Thero, and Bante Kusala. Much merit to you all of you all, for joining us in the panel. How can I thank the most venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi for your illuminating sermon on the Poson full moon day? We had over 275 friends worldwide participating on our Zoom link today. So it shows how we have high regard to you, Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. Thank you very much. I don't
Thank
know
you. Thank you.
how to express our delight and the merit, much merit to you. It is also notable to mention that last year, for the Poson full moon Poya day, the sermon was conducted by Venerable Pasnagoda Rahula Thero of Texas. The topic was the introduction of Buddhism by Arahat Mahinda Thera at Mahintale. So, the most venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi's sermon today was very appropriate to continue with our program, exploring the Buddha's discourse on the elephant footprint based on the Kulahati Padopama Sutra. And you also referred to Venerable Dr. Valpola Rahula's book, The History of Buddhism, which I believe has been translated to many languages. I had the pleasure of meeting Venerable Dr. Valpola Rahula in my youth, because he had been in the same hall as my uncle at the University of Colombo when they were students. So it rekindled my thoughts how nice of you to refer to Venerable Rahula's book. Much merit to you today for this interesting sermon. We hope that we will have your presence once again in our International Dhamma program. Thank you very much, Venerable
Okay, thank
Bhikkhu
you.
Bodhi. Sadhu, sadhu. And finally, thank you, Lakshman, for organizing this full moon, Poson Full Moon Poya Day program and all the programs. And much merit to all of you. Thank you. Thank you, Sadhu.
Thank
Sadhu.
you, Kamal. Thank you. Most Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, we have now come to the final stages. So I would now invite Most Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi to pay merit to the Devas and the departed to conclude our Dhamma talk. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Okay, so I'll recite the verses that I usually recite. Did you want to do the idang no nyati nang hotu? Do you do that?
Yes, that also, yeah.
Okay. I'm not sure whether you have a fixed order. So we'll just do so.
Devas, Sata, Sapta, and Tavatata.
Okay. So do that one first.
Yes.
Okay. So akasa ta chabuma ta deva naga mahidika punyanta manumoditva chirangra kantu sasanang akasa ta chabuma ta deva naga mahidika punyanta manumoditva chirangra kantu desanang akasa ta chabuma ta deva naga mahidika punyanta manumoditva Chirangra kantu mang parang. And then you can do idang no nyati nang hotu sukita hantu nyatayo. You could do that too.
Sukita hantu nateo. Dhamme nyati nang hotu sukita hantu nateo. So
And then
that's it.
that's it.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much. Yeah.
So thank you and much merit to Most Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. I think as Kamal mentioned, we had a large audience, both Sri Lankans and from overseas countries, and I'm sure that they are all appreciative of the Dhamma sermon that was done today, and that they will gain a lot of
Yeah.
merit for their great work that will be done. And I must also thank our Venerable Vajirarami Gnanasigatero and also Most Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi and our other panelists who are present here, our committee members. They have all been helping us, and also the Dayakas who were present from local and overseas. And I'm sure that we will be sending them the recording so that they will be able to listen to it and get greater knowledge on the Dhamma that have been preached by Most Venerable Bhikkhu. Sadhu. Thank you, and we will now
Okay,
conclude.
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.